Good evening, everyone, and welcome to week 3 of Great Decisions at Manitowoc Public Library. Before we get going tonight, just a couple quick announcements. I know it bothers everyone that the library is a bit darker than people would like it to be. We're aware of the situation, just so you know. It's a combination of contractor issues and supply chain. As soon as we can get more light in the library, trust me, that's absolutely what we want. It was great when the Evergleams were here because it really lit up the library. Oh, yeah. Right? But they won't let them keep us all the entire year through. So soon there will be better lighting in the library. So that said, thank you for being here. Sorry to start off on kind of a negative note, but I just wanted to let you know that we hear you and we understand it's a problem, but let's get into the meat of it then. I would like to thank our sponsors this evening for the Great Decisions Lecture Series, not just tonight, but every night of the series. I would like to thank the League of Women Voters of Manitowoc County, the Manitowoc Public Library, the Manitowoc Public Library Foundation, and the Lakeshore Unitarian Universalist Fellowship. So a big round of applause for all our sponsors. Also, I always like to mention a program that's coming up, and this program is coming up March 14th. So it seems like it's a ways away, but it's called Extraordinary, and it is antique experts Mark Moran is going to be here, evaluating one object per person for 40 people. So it's kind of like a mini Antiques Roadshow at the library. The reason I bring it up, registration opens next Monday at 5 o'clock. You can either call the library or you can stop by the main service desk and register. But just so you know, you just get slotted into the time it gives you. You can't pick and choose a time. But it's from 1 to 4, we're seeing 40 people. So, just wanted to call that to your attention. Before I introduce our magnificent speaker for the evening, I'm going to turn the microphone over to someone who is magnificent in an altogether different way. Her children think there might be something happening between the two of us. I don't know. It wasn't me that started this rumor, but Darlene Wellner from the League of Women Voters in Manitowoc County would like to make an announcement.
I assure you, it's only friendship. Only friendship.
A man can dream.
He's flattering. Okay, what I really came up here to say is tomorrow is an extremely important election for school board. It's a primary election. And I hope I know many of you are probably not in the school district, but if you are, please, please, please vote. It's a very important election. And we have one person here that's running for office. Carrie,
stand up.
Carrie,
hi, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you, Darlene. And I tease her, but the League of Women Voters have done so many important things and continue to do so many important things. But, you know, someone needs to give Darlene just a little bit of the business every once in a while, so I guess that falls to me. But let me introduce our speaker this evening. Beth Dougherty is Major Professor of International Relations and Professor of Political Science at Beloit College. She received her MA and PhD in Foreign Affairs from the University of Virginia. Since joining the Beloit faculty in 1996, she has taught a broad range of international politics courses, including U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East, the politics of mass killing, human rights, and nationalism and ethnic conflict. She has received both campus and national awards for innovative teaching. Her main research interests are transitional justice, focusing on the cases of Iraq, Sierra Leone, and Bosnia, human rights, and Iraqi politics. So, you didn't come here to listen to me talk on and on, so let me turn the evening over to Professor Beth Dougherty.
Thanks, Tim. Can you hear me? Yeah, is that on?
Yeah.
No.
It doesn't sound very loud.
No.
so it is green.
Okay. Where is it? Okay, it should be up. Let me turn it up.
Okay.
Please talk amongst yourselves while I address
Can you hear me now? Is that better?
Yeah.
Yeah? Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you, Tim. And thanks to the League of Women Voters and the Manitowoc Public Library for inviting me to come up here again. I've been coming probably now, 15 years, maybe, even longer than that, on a yearly basis. So tonight, I'm going to talk about the U.S. position in the Middle East. For a very long time, U.S. administrations have been talking about the so-called pivot to Asia, right? To get out of the Middle East, because the United States has bigger strategic interests in countering China's power. And so with eventually, once the U.S. troops were out of Afghanistan, most U.S. forces were out of Iraq and of Syria, the notion was that the pivot was finally going to happen here under the Biden administration. And the hope was that the Americans could lessen their commitment in the Middle East, right? But there's that old line in a movie, just when you think you could get out, they pull you back in again. And October 7th has certainly altered the U.S. calculus about what it can do in the Middle East and the degree to which it actually can afford a pivot to Asia at this point. What I'd like to do is look at the three main long-term interests that the United States has had in the Middle East and how they have been impacted by what happened on October 7th and its aftermath. Okay. So more or less since 1948, the United States has been committed to the safety and security of Israel as one of the major interests in the Middle East, committed to freedom of navigation and the free flow of energy out of the Persian Gulf. This is the so-called Carter Doctrine in 1980, where the U.S. said the U.S. would use force in order to defend freedom of navigation and the free flow of energy. And then after the overthrow of the Shah of Iran and the Islamic Republic in 1979, containing the Islamic Republic has become a major feature of American interests in the Middle East. In recent years, of course, the major focus has been on preventing the Iranians from getting a nuclear weapon, and that remains perhaps the number one issue the U.S. faces with Iran. All three of these issues, Israel, Iran, freedom of navigation, are interconnected and have been impacted by what happened on October 7th. Sorry. The other piece about this is that all of them have connections to domestic politics in the United States in an election year. So there's been bipartisan support for safety and security of Israel as a U.S. interest for decades. What's interesting is that at this point, that bipartisanship is under threat. Not just from the Republican side, but also from the Democratic side. So there's some weakening that is happening around that interest that is directly going to impact the presidential election. Iranian proxy forces in the Middle East are targeting American forces. And so, of course, 3 U.S. service members died in Jordan last month. The U.S. having to commit military forces into the Middle East, the U.S. losing personnel in the Middle East, again, is likely to have a big impact on the presidential election. Right? And then lastly, there are worries about the economic repercussions of what will happen if freedom of navigation in the Middle East continues to be disrupted. And economic concerns, of course, are going to be central to the presidential election in the fall. So the United States is dealing with a fairly complicated international arena with respect to the Middle East, which is then exacerbated by the fact that we have to see that there are these domestic political issues. Right? So I'm going to start with the safety and security of Israel. I'm not really going to talk about the degree to which this should be a U.S. interest, although I'd be happy to talk about that in the Q&A. But I would just note that the United States has, for a very long time, been a major backer of the State of Israel. What I think many people do not know is that military commitment that the United States has did not start in 1948. Right, as you can see from this chart, in the early years of Israel's existence, U.S. aid was actually quite small. The two big spikes that you can see, those are in the 1970s. The first big one is after the 1973 October War, right, between Israel, Egypt, and Syria. The next one is after the Islamic Revolution. The yellow lines is economic aid to Israel. Long after Israel became an advanced, industrialized, post-industrialized economy, the United States was still sending economic aid there. That has finally been phased out in recent years. Fairly consistently since the signing of the Camp David Accords in 1979, the United States has committed billions of dollars in military aid every year to Israel. And the United States has committed to what it calls the quantitative military edge with respect to Israel. This has been policy since October of 1973 and has actually been law since 2008 because Congress finally codified what had been practiced. What the qualitative military edge means in practice is Israel gets first crack at U.S. equipment, and it gets better U.S. equipment than anybody else in the region. The idea is that Israel needs that military edge in order to be able to defend itself in a hostile environment. When Arab states, for example, like Saudi Arabia, get a US-made platform, Israel either gets a more advanced version of the same platform or the ability to customize the US system. When the US is selling major defense articles to Middle Eastern states, Israel gets an offsetting weapons package or additional military aid for that. Israel has special privileges that no other state has. So it's the bulk of the nearly, at this point, $4 billion in military aid to Israel is in what's called foreign military financing. Israel gets this in a lump sum the first year of the first month of every fiscal year. So the US will basically deposit essentially $3 billion into a bank account with the Federal Reserve, which is interest bearing. Israel gets to keep the interest, right? Everybody else, the US doles the money out across the course of the year, but not for the Israelis. Israel is considered to be a major non-NATO ally. That also means that the United States will sell it excess defense articles. The U.S. has a stockpile of about $1 billion worth of weapons and ammunitions that it keeps in Israel, which Israel actually can tap into if it needs to. The U.S. and Israel together have developed a number of really important missile defense systems. Many of you have probably heard of the Iron Dome, right, which can shoot down missiles that are coming in. But then there are David Sling, Arrow 2, and Arrow 3. All of those are, again, to shoot out ballistic and cruise missiles while they are still in the air. If anything, the U.S. commitment to Israel in terms of military aid has actually gone up. The U.S. signs 10-year agreements, memorandum of understandings with the Israelis, as you can see from this. The most recent memorandum of understanding, which covers 2009 to 2019 to 2028, is more money than the previous memorandum of understanding, and the Israelis can get more on top of that, which is, of course, right now what Biden is trying to do. One of the problems with U.S. assistance, military assistance to Israel that has really come up recently is the Leahy Law. So there is a law on the books in the United States which basically says that the United States is prohibited from furnishing military aid to any foreign security entity when there is credible information that the unit has committed a gross violation of human rights. And so there's been a lot of discussion about why the Leahy Law has not been used against Israel. There have been a couple of occasions actually where the U.S. has investigated, but it's never cut the Israelis off from any portion of its military assistance over the Leahy Law. But clearly that has become something that many people have become concerned about, given what has been going on in Gaza. The other thing is that now what we see is that support in the United States for Israel, which, again, bipartisan support for decades, is suddenly starting to erode under the weight of Israel's campaign in Gaza. So I have a couple of opinion survey questions here that you can see. So this question is asking whether or not U.S. adults believe the military response from Israel has gone too far. And as you can see, it's about 50% at this point think that it has actually gone too far. This question is showing that Biden's approval rating in terms of his handling of the Middle East has steadily been eroding. So there was an initial bump in the immediate aftermath of October 7th that people supported the notion of closely embracing Israel. As the war has gone on and as casualties have gone up, that has started to erode. In particular, of course, it is eroding amongst some critical constituencies for Biden's reelection campaign, Democrats and younger people. I would note that there is a clear generational gap. The oldest generations, right, whose memories are of the Israel of 1948, right, the Israel of 1967, across the board, very firm support. But the closer you get to the current generation, the more and more that support drops off. And if you think about the younger generations, right, the Israel that they have known is an Israel of occupation. Right? It is an Israel that has been seen to not be willing to engage in any kind of peace talks with the Palestinians. It is an Israel that is seen to be a major human rights abuser. So part of this is just simply the generations of the different narratives that generations have absorbed about Israel and about its importance in U.S. foreign policy. This is going to be a considerable issue for the president as he moves forward, right? And so here you can also see, thinking about that people are beginning to think the United States provides too much support for Israel. I would note this conversation actually has started several years before the current situation. Is even former ambassadors, U.S. ambassadors to Israel, had said, hey, Israel is a very rich country. Israel has one of the most advanced defense industries in the entire world. Israel doesn't need to be dependent on the United States in this way anymore. It doesn't need $3 billion. And in some ways, it might actually be undermining Israel's defense by continuing to make them so dependent on the U.S. And the recognition that the very close relationship between Israel and the United States is harming the U.S.'s image, not just in the Middle East, but in the developing world at large. I think many Americans have no idea just how anti-Israel opinion is outside of the United States, and how much people in the developing world blame the United States for what Israel is doing. And so that's been part of this conversation that has been spurred in recent years about, does the United States really need to give the Israelis as much money as it does? Can there be a different footing for this relationship? But October 7th has sort of removed some of that conversation. Most people now who are saying they think that the Israelis need to get less assistance, it's because they oppose, right, the Netanyahu government and the current situation in Israel. So the amount of money that the Americans supply to the Israelis, you would think would provide it with a significant amount of leverage, but really that's not the case. Right? We've been able to see that the Biden administration can influence Israel's conduct, but it cannot change Israeli conduct. And so there is a question about whether or not the U.S. has the political will to use the military assistance it provides to Israel in a way that would get Israel to change its strategic objectives vis-a-vis Gaza. Okay. All right. I want to shift to thinking about Iran. When the Biden administration took office, it wanted to revive the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA. This was the agreement that had been negotiated in the Obama administration about Iran's nuclear program that the Trump administration had then withdrawn from, even though the Iranians were actually abiding by the terms of the agreement. And over the years, what we saw was the Iranians gradually stepping further and further back from the terms of the JCPOA. Unfortunately, the U.S. and the Iranians were not able to come to some kind of revised JCPOA, at least partially because the Iranians were not willing to accept U.S. guarantees, right? To the Biden administration, they basically said, we signed an agreement, we did what we said we would do, and you withdrew unilaterally. How can we trust you for this? And so while there are still fears and serious concerns about Iran's nuclear capability, efforts to revive the JCPOA were at a standstill even before October 7th happened. Right? But Iran is a revisionist power in the Middle East. It wants U.S. forces out of the region. Right? This is probably its number one foreign policy goal in the Middle East, is to force the Americans to finally withdraw all of its military forces from the Middle East. It is engaged in a long-term regional rivalry with Saudi Arabia. There was some sign that maybe this was thawing a little bit. In March of 2023, the Chinese government brokered an agreement between Saudi Arabia and Iran that they would normalize their relations. Apparently, most of the heavy lifting on that agreement actually was the Iraqis and the Omanis, but then the Chinese came in and gave it like great power approval. Things have not turned out there as people expected that they would, and then October 7th has made that more difficult. So the rivalry with Saudi Arabia remains, and of course, Israel is implacably hostile to Israel, right? Iran has been using for decades an asymmetrical strategy with respect to the United States to counter U.S. power using the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, right? And its subsidiary arm, the Quds Force, which is the branch of the Iranian military that actually operates overseas, right? It's one of 8 different pieces to the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. You may remember that the United States assassinated Qasem Soleimani, the head of the Quds Force, in January of 2020. But nonetheless, despite that decapitation, it has not limited Iran's ability to use the Quds Force at a variety of places throughout the Middle East. So Iran has proxies throughout the region. Even though we tend to lump them all together as Iranian proxies, it is important to note that Iran has varying degrees of influence and control, right? So some of these groups are really actually under the command and control of the Quds Force, and so Tehran can tell them what to do, they'll do that. But for others, it's more like a partnership. So Iran has influence, but it does not have control, right? So we'll start off Iraq, 4 major, these are not the only militias, by the way, these are just the 4 major Iranian-backed militias that are there. Kataib Hezbollah is probably the most dangerous from the perspective of the United States. They probably have between 20 and 30,000 militia members that are still armed. They have been trained and they receive their weaponry from the Quds Force. Asab al-Haq, which was founded in 2006, also trained, armed, funded by the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. Those two organizations were responsible for a lot of the American casualties in Iraq in the latter years of the U.S. presence there. They both are responsible for the deaths of hundreds of American service members. With the exception of the Badr organization, those first three groups, actually, Iran has a pretty substantial degree of control over them. So, for example, Iran sent an emissary to Kataib Hezbollah and said, you have to say you're going to stop attacking American troops, right? Because it's disrupting the region. And so Kataib Hezbollah actually did release a statement like that, although they then, within several days, reneged and they flipped that back again. But nonetheless, I mean, Iran has that kind of ability to change what they're doing in Iraq. Iran very much wants the final U.S. forces that are left in Iraq to be forced out. The U.S. has about 2,500 troops that are still in Iraq. They are there on a training mission. They help the Iraqi army with counterterrorism because, ISIS is still present in places in Iraq. But there's a lot of pressure on the United States by the Iraqi government, right, that the U.S. should be withdrawing its forces from there. In Lebanon, of course, the major Iranian allied force is Hezbollah, right, which was founded in 1982. These are probably partner organizations, right? Hezbollah has a tremendous ability to maneuver within Lebanon, but nonetheless, its leadership is very closely tied to the leadership of the Islamic Republic. Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, this is really more because they all agree that they don't like Israel, right? Because Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad are Sunni Islamist organizations, which is at odds with the Shia thrust of Iranian foreign policy. But the Iranians are always looking for ways that they can undermine the safety and security of Israel. And so they have been channeling funds, et cetera, to both of them. I would note there have been several occasions where the Iranians have cut them off because they have disagreed over policy. Hamas, for example, refused to support Bashar al-Assad's regime in Syria. They supported the rebels, and the Iranians are supporting the Assad regime. So for about a year, the Iranians cut financial assistance to Hamas. Eventually, they patched that over and they started again. The degree to which Iran was aware that Hamas was planning the October 7 attack, we don't really know. We may never really have a firm grasp on just how much the Iranians knew before that took place. But for many, they hold Iran responsible anyhow because of the fact that the Iranians were supplying Hamas with weapons, with money, etc. The two groups in Syria, I'm not really going to talk very much about, except I will note that the Iranians have been using these groups in Syria as kind of frontline forces. And so there was, when the US bombed in Iraq and Syria recently, it hit bases where you had members of the Fatimiyyun Brigade. And these are Afghan refugees living in Iran who have signed up. They get paid well. They're going to then be allowed to stay in Iran rather than forced back into Afghanistan. But anyway, the Iranians withdrew their personnel. The U.S. had been signaling it was going to bomb. So the Iranians took their people out, but they couldn't abandon the bases. So they left people from the brigade there. And at least a dozen Hazara were killed. But the Iranians haven't acknowledged that. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps has not reached out to their families. So there's a lot of pictures, etc., and things that are surfacing on social media of funerals, for example, that are being held in Iran for these Hazara refugees that were killed in Syria. And the families are upset because they have not been acknowledged by the Iranians. And then we have the Houthis in Yemen, which I will come back to in a moment, because that is a big part of what is happening in the region right now. So, from the perspective of the United States, it knows that these are dangerous militia groups, especially from its perspective or from its experience, the ones that are in Iraq. Right? While the war in Syria took up most people's attention over the last decade, there was also a civil war that was happening in Yemen, which is where the Houthis come into all of this. So the Houthis they are Shia, but they are not the same type of Shia that the Iranians are. There are doctrinal differences between the two, and in particular, Yemeni Shia do not believe in the supreme leader, right? The position that Ayatollah Khomeini and then Ayatollah Khamenei hold. Hezbollah now agrees with that interpretation, but the Houthis do not. But this movement actually emerged as part of a religious revival in northern Yemen, married with a lot of anti-American sentiment and a lot of discontent about the fact that the northwest region where the Houthis live had been marginalized by the government. Right. The Houthis were able to capture much of Sana'a by late 2014. They continued pushing south, and they pushed out the recognized government in Yemen. So the Houthis control a significant portion of Yemen now, where 80% of Yemen's population lives in the areas that the Houthi control. The Houthi have been very oppressive in those areas, but they have been able to justify this repression to the population under their control as we are being attacked by foreigners, right? Because the Saudis, in coalition with a number of other countries in the Middle East, entered the war in Yemen against the Houthis, right? Because the Saudis said that the Houthis were Iranian proxies. And a lot of people think that actually this was a self-fulfilling prophecy, that there were some links between the Houthis and the Iranians, but the Houthis are an independent organization. Over time, as it became apparent that the Houthis could really put a lot of pressure on Saudi Arabia, the Iranians began to strengthen their ties with them. The Houthis are still more of a partner than they are a proxy for Tehran. So it isn't entirely clear that Tehran could tell them to stop doing something and that you would be able to get the Houthis to do that. I would just also note on here, so all of those signs, this is the Houthi slogan, which they have been propagating since 2002. So this is not something that has emerged only because of what's recently happened. And you'll see the 5 lines, it reads, God is great, death to the US, death to Israel, curse the Jews, victory for Islam. So the Houthis have a great deal of anger and hatred towards the Israelis. And the flip side of that is it's very pro-Palestinian, right? And the Houthis in particular really associate this with the larger cause of repression, injustice, etc. In the world. So there are very close ties among them. Which then brings me to what the Houthis have been doing lately, right? Which has to do with freedom of navigation, right? So the Middle East has 2 of the 3 most important choke points in the world in terms of navigation, right? One thing that's not on this map that I would just note for you, so at the very top, like right underneath the sea and Suez Canal, at the top of that little branch off of the Red Sea, there's an Israeli port there, Eilat, and a Jordanian port there, Aqaba, all right? But so you have the Strait of Hormuz, you have the Bab el-Mandab Strait, and then you have the Suez Canal. So the Strait of Hormuz is the most important in terms of the transport of oil. About a fifth of the global petroleum consumption in the world comes out of the Strait of Hormuz. It is extremely narrow, and you've got the Iranians on the, they've got the entire northern shore of the Persian Gulf. I don't know how well you can see, but there are right at the top where the peninsula sticks out. Those little parallel lines there are the shipping lanes. So it's about 2 miles in one direction and 2 miles in the other direction. Right? And then as you move forward, there's a series of small islands in the shipping lane areas which are disputed between the United Arab Emirates and the Iranians. So the fear traditionally has been that the Iranians might close the Strait of Hormuz. And several years ago, this was a major concern. Of course, the United States has said since 1980 that it is committed to the free flow of oil out of the Persian Gulf, which means it is committed to making sure that the Strait of Hormuz remains open. I would note it's not that important to the United States anymore. The United States in the late 1970s got nearly all of its oil from Persian Gulf countries. It doesn't anymore, right? The U.S. is a net exporter of energy. What we do import tends to come from Saudi Arabia, and it's not very much. The people that are reliant on what's going through the Strait of Hormuz are our European allies and Asia. So for India and China, for example, this is where all of their energy has got to come out of the Persian Gulf through the Strait of Hormuz. More recently, the concern has been the Bab el-Mandab Strait. It's only 18 miles wide at its narrowest point, and like the Strait of Hormuz, at that very narrowest point, you've got these little 2-mile wide paths for ships going in and ships going out. So the sort of bluish lines that are on the map, right? Those are shipping lanes. And so the darker the color, the more ships that are using that particular path, just to give you a sense of how narrow it is to get through the Bab el-Mandab. And then even as you move north through the Red Sea, you can see there's really 2 streams, one for ships moving north and one for ships moving south. Okay? And these are container ship lines that are moving through the Bab el-Mandab. And of course, after you get through that choke point, you get further up, you are headed to the Suez Canal. Okay? Oops, wrong way. Yeah. 12% of world trade goes through the Red Sea and the Suez Canal, right? So this is a major pressure point. I'm sure many of you remember the unfortunate situation of the Ever Given, right? This massive boat that got itself jammed in the Suez Canal, right? Where they literally had to dig out it from the front and use 14 tugboats from the back to get it straight again. But I bring this up simply because a 6-day disruption in traffic from the Suez Canal had massive consequences for the global economy. That is a current concern, right? Given what has been happening with the Houthis, which is on October 19th, the Houthis launched the first attacks. These were aimed at Israel. So at that port of Eilat, which is, way far to the north of the Red Sea, those were the earliest efforts that the Houthis made. And they said they were doing this in solidarity with the Palestinians. So they're launching these missiles. Of course, they did not get to Eilat. And the next phase of this campaign was, first of all, they realized they were not getting much out of this, right? Because they couldn't actually harm Israel. And at least one of those missiles fell in Egypt, which the Egyptians were not pleased about. So the Houthis decided that they would begin attacks closer to home. They would start to go after shipping in the Gulf of Aden, which is the rate as you're moving into the Bab el-Mandab Strait, and then the Bab el-Mandab Strait itself. It helps that the portion of Yemen that the Houthis control is actually, you can kind of see it on this map. So you see the cross-hatched portions. Basically, they have that coast of Yemen onto the Red Sea. So the Houthis are in a very good position to be able to attack into the Gulf of Aden and into the Red Sea, especially around the Bab el-Mandab Strait. The second phase of this was the Houthis said they were only going to attack vessels that were going to Israel, right, or that were Israeli flagged or had some connection to Israel. That was hard, and also there weren't that many, and so then they kind of broadened it out, right, and then they just generally started attacking shipping in the region. So this map, which is through this was the latest that I could find, map form. So you can see the different places where the Houthis have been able to attack traffic that is going through there. They're using a variety of methods to do this. So they're using drones, right? Both aerial and waterborne, right? The United States actually destroyed a submersible just within the last few days. They have anti-ship, cruise, and ballistic missiles that they are firing out at ships. They are using waterborne improvised explosive devices. They are using unmanned vessels. So the ship that there was a British ship that was hit within the last week. The crew was actually evacuated. All the stories this morning were that the fears were the ship was taking water on and that it actually might sink, which would be this would be the biggest strike that the success that the Houthis have had, if indeed that is what happens. But that was a case where they floated a boat close to the ship, and then the little boat blows up and it blew a hole in the side of the larger shipping. The Houthis are probably getting targeting information from the Iranians. So the Iranians have a surveillance ship. It's just a regular ship outfitted with all kinds of electronic surveillance equipment. It was in the Red Sea. In the last few weeks, it repositioned itself into the Gulf of Aden. Houthi attacks began to favor the Gulf of Aden, and so most people think that the Iranians are actually sharing targeting information with the Houthis. There is some concern that the Houthis are trying to send messages about who they're hitting and who they're not hitting. So, for example, initially they said they wouldn't hit boats coming from Saudi Arabia or the UAE. Well, that has not happened in fact. They said they weren't going to hit Chinese vessels, and some Chinese shipping companies are still going through the Red Sea, but not all of them. All right, some of the largest Chinese shipping companies are actually taking the route around the Cape of Good Hope. I heard a talk the other day by the former head of CENTCOM, who said that he thinks that the idea that the Houthis are good enough to be able to tell the difference between a Chinese ship and a not Chinese ship vastly overestimates their technical capabilities. And they actually hit a ship that was bound for Iran. All all right, who they're major backers. It was full of corn coming from Brazil. But the problem with this is, of course, regardless of whose ships they're actually hitting and whether they hit anybody or not, because there's been, to this point, they hijacked one ship by helicopter. And actually, they took that ship back to Yemen. The crew is still being held hostage. They're mainly Filipinos and other Asian. There is kind of a connection to Israel, but it's really hard with international shipping because it's like, who's flagging the vessel? Who owns the vessel? Where is the, where's whatever's on the ship? Where is that going? Where is it coming from? Which port is it coming from? Which port is it going to? So it can get very complicated around that. So what has happened is ships have started moving around the Cape of Good Hope. So they are going around Africa rather than going through the Red Sea and up into the Suez Canal. You can see the chart over there is just, see that great upswing in black. That's comparing boats going around the Cape of Good Hope this year to where it was last year. So there's been a significant increase in the decision to begin moving materials around in that way. This is just another. This one is useful, I think, because actually there are two kinds of ships that are going through: container ships and bulk ships. And container ships are the ones like the Ever Given that have those big containers on them, like 20 or 40-foot containers. And so what this is looking at is if you have 7,500 40-foot containers or more on a boat. The Ever Given, by the way, had 18,300 containers on it when it got stuck in the Suez. So the big container ships are the ones that are taking the detour around the Cape of Good Hope. The ones that are the bulk shipping, which tends to be like agricultural products, raw materials, it's lower value, it's smaller ships, those tend to continue. So the shipping prices for those kinds of ships is pretty much where it's been, but there's been a tremendous increase in cost to ship a 40-foot container, right? I would also note, though, it is nowhere close to what it was during COVID, right? Or actually even during the Ever Given. During COVID, at one point, it was about $14,000 to ship a 40-foot container. It's somewhere in the vicinity of $5,000 to $7,000 now. So even though prices have gone up significantly, it hasn't had the same sort of impact yet on the global economy. And that's one of the reasons for this. Now, it doesn't just cost more money to go around the Cape of Good Hope. It takes significantly more time in order to do this. In the US, this has not really been an issue, right? The US is not reliant really on the shipping that is going through the Red Sea. It's the European Union. That is the major thoroughfare for stuff coming from Asia into the European Union and then headed back in the other direction. China and India are both taking a big hit. Both of them get a lot of energy out of this region, and they are sending a lot of goods into the region through the Red Sea. China's position in all of this has been very interesting because, China is having economic difficulties. It's been trying to play a much bigger role in the Middle East, trying to challenge the U.S. primacy, trying to erode the U.S.-led order in the Middle East. It was responsible for brokering this agreement between the Saudis and the Iranians in early 2023. And it really stands to lose if the Houthis continue to force shipping to go around the Cape of Good Hope. But China has really not been willing to say anything, right? There are reports that after the Americans and the European Union representatives pressured China, China did tell the Iranians, tell the Houthis to stop targeting shipping in the Red Sea, right? But this is like multiple levels of influence, right? How much influence does China actually have over Iran? How much influence does Iran actually have over the Houthis? And are the Chinese saying that they're telling the Iranians this, but then neither of them are really doing anything, because then they can say to the Americans, oh, yeah, we told them. But for example, the UN Security Council condemned the Houthi attacks on maritime shipping earlier in January, and there were 4 abstentions. One of them was China. Right? So it wasn't even willing to join a UN Security Council resolution on this. China is worried that if it is seen to be siding with the Americans over the shipping, right, that it might tarnish its credentials with the developing world, where support for Palestine is very important. And so China is trying to present itself as a champion of the developing world, as and aligning itself with the Palestinians. If it condemns the Houthis, given that the Houthis are saying they're doing this to help the Palestinians, they're not sure that that looks good for them. And so right now, China really is not playing any role in this issue. And I mean, this is one of those things to sort of, if you think about the broader ramifications of China's behavior right now in the Middle East, if, in fact, the liberal international order that has more or less been in place since the end of the Second World War and certainly since the end of the Cold War, if that is being eroded by the Chinese and by the Russians, what is the new order going to look like if it is China that is going to become the dominant power? Countries in the Middle East started to move towards China, at least partially because, like Saudi Arabia, for example, was afraid they couldn't trust the Americans anymore. The U.S. signed the JCPOA with Iran. The U.S. said it was going to pivot to Asia. The U.S. has been making a lot of noise, right? We would like to get out of the Middle East, etc. Saudi Arabia wasn't sure they could trust the Americans, so they thought, well, we're going to need to have a backup plan. We'll look to the Chinese. But the Chinese are doing nothing to protect maritime navigation. And so that may have, I mean, they're playing a very complicated game where they're trying to be friends with everybody in the Middle East and not criticize anybody either. But that is a very difficult balancing act, especially if countries in the region start to believe that the Chinese are pursuing their own narrow interests at the expense of the region's interests. Then China may find that not acting actually erodes its influence rather than increases it. So why are the Houthis doing this? First, of course, this is a movement that from its founding was very anti-Israel. And so it almost had to do something to show that it was supporting the Palestinians, because this is the basis of its ideological claims in Yemen. It taps into a lot of frames in Yemen which have very deep roots, right? So it really resonates with people in Yemen. Talk about oppression, talk about the U.S. as the biggest terrorist state because the U.S. is supporting Israel. Side note, there are a lot of places in the Middle East where people believe that the United States, for example, was in league with Al-Qaeda for 9/11. There are a lot of people in Yemen, in particular, who believe that Al-Qaeda actually is in league with the Americans because repressive pro-American governments can claim terrorism is the threat, which gives them license to then crack down on their domestic populations, right? So that it's just like this vicious cycle. They're all in it together. And so from their perspective, the United States is the terrorist state because it is supporting what Israel is doing in Palestine. And it plays into these conspiracy theories that are really deeply rooted in Yemen about the U.S. and its relationships to groups like Al-Qaeda. The notion of resistance is another piece that's kind of central to the Houthi movement and to their identity. And so what we've seen is that there has been a spurt in popularity in Yemen for the Houthis. They control 80% of Yemen's population. They've been very oppressive. There's been a lot of discontent, but that's been relatively quiet because they were able to make this argument that they were being attacked by Saudi Arabia, right? And that's what justified these measures. Well, in 2020, or 2022, there was 6 months of a ceasefire in the war in Yemen. And that pretty much, even though the ceasefire eventually expired, fighting has been at a minimal level. And the Houthis and the Saudis have been talking to one another. In fact, a Houthi delegation went to Saudi Arabia right before October 7th. Right? This is a UN-mediated process. There was a lot of belief, actually, that the UN mediator was close to getting an agreement between the Saudis and the Houthis when October 7 happened. And so when the fighting died down, the Houthis began to face a lot of domestic discontent over poor governance, their inability to provide basic services, the fact that civil service salaries have not been paid in Yemen in years. There have been protests, there have been strikes, and so part of what the Houthis undoubtedly are doing is using these attacks on shipping in the Red Sea, right, to distract people's attention from the domestic problems in Yemen. This is sort of the wag the dog kind of idea. You use some sort of domestic thing or a foreign crisis to distract from your domestic problems, right? And it has been helpful because actually some people who didn't support the Houthis now are, because they're on board with this kind of anti-Israel, anti-American message. The Houthis are burnishing their legitimacy in the region at large because they're able to make the argument, we're the only Arabs that are standing up to the Israelis. Even Hezbollah is not really doing anything. We're the only ones that are actually taking action. There's also a performative aspect to this because it doesn't ultimately really matter whether or not they hit ships and cause damage. It's the fear that they'll hit ships and cause damage, which is going to make the ships move. But the Houthis get all kinds of international coverage. They get all kinds of domestic coverage. And they're able to shape this narrative about how they are standing up to these oppressive regional powers. So it has a lot of domestic reasons for wanting to do this that go well beyond just simply its anti-Israel sentiments. There was some people had thought that maybe what they were doing had to do with the negotiations, the UN-mediated negotiations, because the Houthis in the past, when there have been efforts at talks, sometimes have escalated what they're doing so that they can then de-escalate back to where they were before and say, oh, but we're de-escalating, we're doing what you said. Or that they thought this would give them leverage over the Saudis and maybe they could get more concessions. That does not actually seem to be the case because apparently the Saudis and the UN did want to put freedom of navigation on the table in those talks, and the Houthis said no, because they argued this is about the war in Gaza. It has nothing to do with the war in Yemen. So if their idea was they were going to use it for leverage in those talks, that they don't seem to be willing to do that, right? And there are concerns, of course, now that those talks are not going to go anywhere, right? Because of what the Houthis are doing. So quickly, what has the American response been to this? Well, part of it has been multilateral, getting the UN security to condemn. The US got about 4 dozen countries to write a letter condemning maritime aggression. Nearly every major country that goes through the Suez Canal signed that. And then the United States launched Operation Prosperity Guardian, which is a naval deterrence. They're actually escorting ships through the Red Sea. This will give you an indication of just how bad the United States' reputation is right now because of its support for Israel. About half of the countries that the US says are part of Prosperity Guardian will not publicly acknowledge that. They might be cooperating, but they don't want to be seen as siding with the United States as long as the US is tied to what's happening in Gaza. Just in the last few days, the European Union also has added a defensive naval protection operation that's going to be commanded by the Italians. So you do have the Americans and the Europeans that are engaging in these kind of multilateral naval operations. One strategy that some in the U.S. military really think the United States should definitely up a great deal is interdiction, right? Stop the flow of weapons and parts from Iran to the Houthis. There was a major seizure on January 11th where it took advanced cruise and ballistic missile parts that had clearly come from Iran. It was the first time since 2019 that the U.S. had seized something like that. And then there was the second interdiction that also happened, this unmanned boat, which had all of this various weaponry on that. So the officials that are kind of pushing the notion of an interdiction strategy have said, look, this is less of an escalation in terms of the use of force, right? You're not bombing. You're just simply stopping ships, boarding them, taking whatever it is that they've got. And that this might be a way to degrade the Houthis' capabilities without giving the Houthis the ability to point to the U.S. as the aggressor, which is what happens when the U.S. uses military strikes. Interdiction also, there's an international legal precedent for this because there's been an arms embargo on the Houthis since 2015. The UN re-upped that embargo for another year in November of 2023. So it is illegal actually for the Iranians to be supplying the Houthis. And then the third piece of the U.S. response to this point has been military strikes. But I have to say, these are largely symbolic, right? And they're hoping to degrade their capabilities. They're hoping for some deterrence. But the U.S. recognizes that it is not likely that it is actually going to be completely successful in using these kinds of military strikes. If for no other reason, look, the Houthis have lots of experience in hiding their military assets from aerial bombardment. The Saudis bombed in Yemen for years and years and years, and that did not degrade Houthi capabilities. And the U.S. is not. I mean, what the U.S. is doing is occasional targeted strikes. A lot of, in Yemen proper, most of the U.S. Military action is shooting down the missiles that the Houthis have shot at ships in the Red Sea. That's why very few vessels have actually been damaged. A lot of the missiles have either been destroyed on the ground before the Houthis can launch them, or they've been shot down after they've been launched. There have been some people who said, look, U.S. missiles are really, really, really expensive. And we're spending, like, these are multi-million-dollar weapons that you're using to shoot down these drones that don't cost anything and that the Houthis can easily replace either with parts from Iran or they're building them themselves. So So there have been at least 3 major bombing strikes in Yemen proper over the last several weeks. And then the other piece to the military strikes gets us back to the other Iranian proxies in Iraq, where there's been a pretty sustained campaign of attacks against U.S. forces in Syria. We have about 900 forces in Syria. We have about 2,500 forces in Iraq. And the U.S. put up with this for a number of weeks before it did anything. But once the 3 service members were killed, that required a more robust response. And that's where the U.S. hit about 85 targets in Syria and in Iraq. And then several days later, it launched a drone strike that killed a senior commander with Kataib Hezbollah, who the United States said it had evidence had been involved in planning the operations that killed Americans. The use of these kinds of military strikes, though, again, the Biden administration does not want to have to engage in a sustained air campaign again in the Middle East. There's just no public appetite for that. And it's clear that the U.S. is signaling to the Iranians, we don't want to escalate this any further. The Iranians have actually signaled that they don't want escalation either. Part of this might be for the Iranian perspective. They have to feel like they're kind of winning, right? I mean, the Israelis are in a terrible position. They have no international support, even support in the United States for Israel is fracturing under the weight of what is happening in Gaza, right? And so, the Houthis are threatening international shipping. Everyone is aware of the capabilities of Hezbollah. And so from Tehran's perspective, they may be better off just allowing the Netanyahu government to continue to undermine itself with what is happening in Gaza. Even absent any kind of wider conflict in the Middle East, what this always is going to come back to is the conflict in Gaza, right? And there is no clear end game in Gaza. Eventually, one way or the other, the question of the fate of the Palestinians is going to have to be answered. All of these things ultimately are coming back to that one issue. And the degree to which the United States has enough leverage and or the political will to use the leverage that it has to get the Israelis to make changes, I think is really open to question. So with that, I will stop, and I'd be happy to take any questions that anyone might have. Sorry, I went longer than I expected. I always think it'll take me 20 minutes, and then.
Fine. Just so you know, questions-wise, the resilient Emily Brandt will be running around with the microphone also. We'll be taking questions online. Please remember, and this is also for people online that are making a lot of comments. We're going to get to as many people as possible before we indulge in people asking more and more questions. So please be respectful of that. Try and get your questions and comments into a conciser format, but let's just get started. So hands up and we'll get going.
Yeah, the elephant in the room, November. Then what happens if the you-know-who gets elected? What happens to all of this? I don't think it's going to be good.
No, I mean, I would say all bets are kind of off at that point. The U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East under the Trump administration was chaotic because Trump tended to make foreign policy by tweet, right? I mean, it's hard to you need a pretty sophisticated timeline to get how many times Trump said the U.S. forces were going to be withdrawn from Syria, and then the Pentagon had to walk him back, and there's still 900 U.S. forces in Syria. And Trump is far more pro-Israel than the Biden administration, even though that might seem hard to believe. But I mean, it was the Trump administration that moved the U.S. embassy to Jerusalem. It was the Trump administration that was doing the Abraham Accords. And some of this is, just like with the Abraham Accords, the Israelis and the Trump administration thought that they could marginalize the Palestinian question. They thought they'd reached a point where we could just safely ignore that and normalize Israel's position. The big prize was going to be normalization with Saudi Arabia, but the understanding was that since Bahrain, for example, and the UAE had gone through with it, they wouldn't have done it if the Saudis hadn't been on board. And now that it would be extraordinarily hard for Saudi Arabia to make any sort of gesture towards Israel as long as the Gaza war is going on. But I mean, Biden is in domestic trouble on the Gaza issue because younger voters are furious about this and don't want to vote for him. One of the largest Arab American communities in the United States is in Michigan, right? And they're saying they're not going to vote for Biden. And so I think that this may, there could be some real consequences for the administration down the road on this issue.
I do have a question online that sort of builds on that, and it's not just the immediate future, but Daryl had the question, how would you guess the Israel-Palestine situation will look like in 20 years? Just to ask you the hard and long-term question right away.
So I would say that, ultimately what has to happen is there has to be a Palestinian state. There's no other way around this. Unfortunately, we're in a situation right now, and it's not only because of what Hamas did on October 7th, but a lot of it is because of what Hamas did on October 7th, where there is almost no appetite whatsoever in Israel to talk about the Palestinian issue. But Israel cannot continue to control the Palestinian population the way that it has been. This is where the apartheid arguments are coming from. And if you look at the legal definition of apartheid and then you look at Israeli conduct, it is hard not to agree that that label fits. People have been saying for a long time that there are, three kinds of things about Israel. It could be a Jewish state, a democratic state, and in the whole land of Israel, right? It can have two of those three things, but getting all three of those things is impossible. And I think that remains true today, because if the Israelis continue on the path that they're on with the West Bank, for example, then the democratic aspect is lost. And right now you have the most right-wing government that in Israeli history. There are parties in Netanyahu's cabinet that in earlier periods in Israeli, these people would have been pariahs. And then now they have cabinet, not just cabinet positions, but cabinet positions with responsibility for national security. And so, in 20 years, I would say something is going to have to break. And there's going to have to be some kind of Palestinian state. There's no other way out of this difficulty.
Hello. The question is, how long can Egypt afford to have the Houthis close their economics down? And isn't that a great move for us? Because it's not hurting our economy that way. Everybody else's costs go up, not ours.
No, that's a great question about Egypt. I think about 2 to 3% of Egypt's gross domestic product comes from revenues from the Suez Canal, and they have been very hard hit. So Egypt would like the Houthis to stop doing this because they need the container traffic to continue to go through. But they're also a bit constrained because they, from the perspective of the Houthis are saying they're doing this because of Gaza. But clearly the Egyptians would like these attacks to stop. the Egyptians could also be putting some leverage on China because the Chinese have put a lot of money into like ports and things on the Red Sea in Egypt. The return on that investment is nothing if you don't actually have ships going through the Suez Canal. And so, yeah, Egypt definitely is hurting as a result of this. Right now, there are all kinds of reasons why this situation isn't as serious as what we saw during COVID. But even though the Houthi attacks had dropped off a little bit after the 3 big bombings that the US and the UK did, then they started back up again. And a lot of the major shipping lines are saying they're just, for the next 6 months, they're just booking out, we're just going Cape of Good Hope. And eventually, those costs might get passed on to American consumers, but I think that's probably well down the road. For now, the U.S. seems to be relatively insulated from things like supply disruptions and higher prices. But the fact that container ship prices are higher, that has also affected lines that aren't going through the Red Sea. So the China to Los Angeles route, for example, the price on that has gone up, not as much as the ones going through the Red Sea. But it's something to keep an eye on for the United States. It's going to be further down the line, though, in terms of an economic implications for us from the problems in the...
Those ships still getting insurance?
Right. It's the insurance that has gone up significantly on the transit. And that's why even if there are only the occasional attack, the insurance is still going to be high. One of the things that has helped is that apparently there were a lot of container ships that were empty. And so they've been able to use those to kind of fill in the gaps as they're to catch up on everything that's being delayed as it goes around Africa. But like I said, this is going to be, maybe 6 months out. That would be the point at which I think you would have to start wondering what the impact would be on the U.S. economy. I don't know that we will totally escape signs of what's happening.
I have another question online, and it's actually a multi-part question, but in the spirit of what I said, I'm just going to ask the first part of it. If Israel doesn't need the money, this is coming from Dina, by the way, if Israel doesn't need the money, the U.S. doesn't have much leverage for the money we give, and our tax dollars are responsible for violations of human rights. In good conscience, how can we continue to make such large sums of money available to Israel?
Yeah, that is the argument that critics of U.S. military aid to Israel are making. When this first surfaced a couple of years ago, and again, you had 2 former U.S. ambassadors to Israel who publicly came out and said the U.S. should vastly scale back what it was doing. The pushback against them was all that does is send a signal to Israel's enemies, right, that Israel doesn't have U.S. support anymore. Even if we're doing it because we think Israel is so strong, that is not the way Israel's enemies are going to take that. Supporters of the alliance argue that Israel is actually a strategic asset for the United States in the region. There's this appeal again to things like shared values, democracy, which is a harder and harder kind of argument to make there. And then I would note that in the United States, probably the biggest supporters of Israel are evangelical Christians. And so that is a demographic that is not interested in any of these kind of moral arguments about Israel committing human rights, because Israel has to be in control of the Holy Land in order for biblical prophecies to come true. So one of the hardest, like you've got AIPAC, the big political action committee for Israel, but then there's also, I think it's called Christians United for Israel. It's very hard line, right? And there are a lot of members of Congress that see this as, this is a holy cow, and they're not going to touch it because they would get domestic backlash. And again, this is not because they're only 2.5% of the U.S. population is Jewish. So this is the support for Israel goes way, way, way beyond that. It's evangelicals, and their position on this aligns with kind of harder line positions on U.S. foreign policy in general. But yeah, I think that's where you will continue to see pushback against the notion that the U.S. should stop supporting Israel. And it's hard to make that argument really right now in the aftermath of October 7 too. It sounds bad, right? For a lot of people. But this is why the younger generation is so angry, because that's what they see. They see human rights violations happening. The U.S. cuts aid off to other countries that engage in human rights violations, but we've never been willing to do it for the Israelis.
We have a question over here.
Yeah, I think I heard a report that Israel gave Gaza to Hezbollah or Palestine like 28 years ago or so.
So Israel withdrew from the Gaza Strip in 2005, right, under the Ariel Sharon was prime minister. But it was strategic because Sharon's idea was if the Israelis withdrew from Gaza, it meant they could keep the West Bank. And Israel may have withdrawn its forces from Gaza, but it never really gave up control. It controlled the land, air, and water boundaries of the Gaza population. It regulated what went into Gaza and what came out of Gaza. And successive Israeli governments have been willing to allow funding to get to Hamas from Qatar and from Iran. Again, because Netanyahu has said this publicly. This is the way to ensure that we don't have to give up the West Bank. Right? This is a way to undermine the Palestinian Authority. Right? I do not think they realized the degree to which Hamas. There seemed to be some sense that actually Hamas had been tamed by giving them money and forcing them to administer the Gaza Strip, that they could cause trouble occasionally, but they were not capable of seriously threatening Israel. That calculus obviously has changed since October 7. But the Israelis will often say that, right? Well, we gave Gaza back in 2005. Well, that's not really what happened.
We have another question over here.
Where would the Palestinian state be?
It has to be in the West Bank.
Okay, and so you can imagine that the West Bank would become the territorial home of the Palestinians, and the Gaza Strip would revert to Egypt, Israel, who?
No, the Gaza Strip would go with the Palestinian state unless, there had been, at different times, there have been discussions about territorial swaps, where you would give some territory to the Palestinians and other territory would go to Israel. Why would Israel want Gaza? Really, it's incredibly poor. There's practically nothing standing in Gaza at this point. But it's got to be the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Those are the areas that will eventually become a Palestinian state. There isn't anywhere else for them to go.
I have another comment that was made online earlier, and don't worry, we still have plenty of time, so we'll get to as many questions as possible. This was a comment that was actually made that I was wondering what your opinion of it was, and this person, this was towards the beginning of the lecture, said that they would say that the younger generation, I think they mean both domestically and in Israel, is more critical because of its ability to access information outside of the current outlets such as TV news, newspaper, radio, versus online social media and direct communication. So how much would you say that has changed the game generationally with direct online communication and social media? I'll try and ask easier questions.
Well, I mean, look, my sense is that you can get information on social media, like from Syria, for example. It was invaluable to help us know what was happening on the ground. But you need to go through like hundreds or thousands of hours of those videos. You need to understand what's happening on the ground. You can't get that from TikTok. I mean, my students drive me insane with this because just like you cannot get a depth of understanding about this. And I had a lot of students right after October 7th who were asking me about this one particular hashtag that was going around. It was like, I don't even remember anymore, but it was like, I think it was hashtag Gaza, hashtag Sudan. And I was like, what is the connection? What is this? What is the connection? And then they were puzzled. They're like, oh, I don't know. Like, this doesn't make any sense at all. My sense is that for the younger generation, the only Israel they have ever been exposed to is this version, right? Is the Netanyahu version of Israel, right? They don't remember Yitzhak Rabin. They didn't grow up with kind of the heroic narrative of Israel that many Americans grew up with, right? As a tiny country that was attacked at its birth, made the desert bloom, these kind of triumphalist narratives that, pretty much my generation and anybody older, that is the Israel that we all grew up on. I would note that there was a period of time in Israel where the Israelis were much more willing to take a critical look at the events of 1948. That kind of never penetrated to US, but I don't think social media actually is helpful in terms of informing the younger generation. It is so easy to manipulate that, and it is also a locus for the spread of extremist hate. So, yeah, I'd like to believe that it's useful, but I don't.
Got a question over here.
Yeah, the other day I was listening a man who was the former head of Sinn Féin, which I think is Israeli Army Intelligence, something like that. Okay, I'm surprised because he's Israeli and he's an insider. He said Israel was founded with two premises. One is territorial conquest, and the other is ethnic cleansing. Kind of like the Israelis, they say, if they say Palestinians are out of here because I'm coming here. He said the only solution, he said, is that Israel reinvent itself and get out this Zionist Ben-Gurion, the founder of the state of Israel. He said what we see today is the result of how Israel was founded. That basically is we are here to conquer the land and all these people are going to be wiped out. Other countries have reinvented themselves, like, for example, the French, they have all these, I don't understand, these republics. Russia, for example, from Soviet Union, what they call themselves now, Russian something. If Israel doesn't do that, he said, and he's from Army Intelligence, it's going to be a point that not even all the money from the US government and the weapons of war is going to make any difference. And then also said the problem that among the Israelis, the Jewish state is not workable because the Israelis, they have the more secular Israelis and the more Zionist Israelis, and they make the Jewish state unworkable. And if it doesn't change, he said the Israeli state is going to collapse as a nation.
I wish I could remember the name of this movie. There's a fabulous documentary that was made. It's an Israeli film, and that's what it is. It's interviews with 6 former heads of Shin Bet, and that is more or less the story that they are all telling, that they had all come to the conclusion that Israel fundamentally needed to change its policy towards the Palestinians. But I cannot remember what this is called. I have it in my office. I can see it on my shelf, but yeah, I can't tell you what the name of it is.
These people in intelligence, they are going the opposite of the state of Israel. That would confuse it.
I think because the intelligence people saw face to face what how much national identity there is that exists among Palestinians, and that their Palestinians are not just simply going to give up that identity. And so I think that that's part of their exposure to the conflict for many, many, many years on a daily basis kind of brought home to them the contradictions in Israel's policy.
We have another question.
Yes, that's it. Thank you. Yay, internet.
What was it again?
It's called the gatekeepers. Yeah, it's a really, really interesting, compelling look. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
So the Hamas attack on October the 7th had a macro goal, right? It wasn't just a terrorist attack, right? I mean, do you think Hamas did that attack to cause all of what you described tonight to happen?
Yeah, I mean, I think that Hamas did this because first, I think they could see that there was the potential for a big shift if the Saudis normalized relations with Israel, that just could not be allowed. Hamas saw the degree to which under the Trump administration, the Palestinian issue had been completely marginalized. It was clear that while support for Palestinians is still really strong on the Arab street, that doesn't really have any meaning anymore for their governments. And so they knew they were being marginalized. And so this is an effort to put the Palestinians back at the center of the conversation. I don't know about that part, simply because what you needed was something that was going to break the stalemate, so that the Israelis would come to see that their best course of action for themselves is actually moving the Palestinians towards statehood. And October 7th is completely, there is no support anymore in Israel, none. And so from that perspective, it was incredibly harmful.
My understanding from other readings and so on, that it actually over the years, the decades, American presidents and so on, and the UN and so on, they've all been talking pretty much a two-state solution. But the Israelis are very willing to have that two-state solution, but the Arabs are not, and it's a matter of religion. Apparently, is that that they just want the Israelites pretty much wiped off the map, and they do not want to share in any way a landmass with them. But in some of the cases from what I've read, there are quite a number of Palestinians that actually live in Israel, and they coexist pretty well, really. But that's and so I don't know. I think that two-state solution is a must, but how you get there, I don't know.
So I would just, when the Oslo Accord was signed by the Israelis and the Palestinians, it was a fundamentally unequal deal to begin with. If you ever go and look at the text of the exchange of letters between them, the Israeli one is about 50 words long. And it basically says it recognizes the Palestinians as the representative of the Palestinian people. The Palestinians is very long, and they put all their cards on the table. They recognized Israel's right to exist, et cetera, et cetera. And there was initial belief that the Oslo Accords was going to be able to move forward, but you had extremists on both sides. So you have Hamas on the Palestinian side that engages in suicide bombings to try to stop the Oslo Accord, and you have a far-right Israeli nationalist who assassinates Yitzhak Rabin. The Israeli right has always been opposed to the existence of a Palestinian state. And since then, if you look at, many of Israel consistently did not follow through on its commitments that it made in this whole series of agreements that comes after Oslo. Part of the reason why the Palestinian Authority lacked legitimacy with the Palestinian people is precisely because of its security cooperation with the Israelis. It looked like an arm of Israel to many Palestinians, right, as opposed to protecting them from the Israeli occupation. Benjamin Netanyahu has no interest in a two-state solution. Likud has no interest in a two-state solution. But it's easier for them to simply blame the Palestinians, and the Palestinians do get the blame nearly all of the time. But that is not an accurate representation. There is plenty of sentiment on the right wing in Israel against the peace process. And Benjamin Netanyahu was engaged in a lot of the incitement that led to the death of Yitzhak Rabin. The comparisons of Rabin to Hitler were very popular with the nationalists' right wing. And you currently have people in Netanyahu's cabinet, again, who do not believe that they should have to give up the West Bank. Problem is, what are they going to do with the Palestinians that are living in the West Bank? I think the narrative that many Americans are familiar with is the one that puts all the blame on the Palestinians, but it's much more complex than that, and the Israelis also bear a lot of responsibility for the fact that we're where we are right now.
We have approximately 5 minutes left, just so you know. So either 3 really fast and easy questions to answer, or maybe just one.
This will be easy. In Saudi Arabia, our news is so good today. They kind of dropped off. Who's kind of won the battle, the old king or the new king? Because the old king loves Palestine, the new king would like to see it go away.
Mohammed bin Salman is in control in Saudi Arabia. I don't think there's any doubt about that. Part of his, he would be willing to normalize relations with Israel, but there's no way they can do that as long as the Gaza war is continuing. And I think that is part of what Hamas wanted to ensure, was that they could short circuit that particular agreement.
Question right here.
Just a quick show of hands from everybody in the room. Who in here thinks Israel's gone too far in the retaliation against the Palestinians?
Yeah.
It's just you're slaughtering fish or food. There's no defense there.
Israel's gone too far. Oh, yeah.
So is there any way Joe can get out of this?
If I knew that, I would get the Nobel Peace Prize, right? Yeah. Joe Biden is of that generation where his vision of Israel is still the heroic version, and that is not the version of Israel that we are all living with right now. And regardless of what the United States did, I think even if it had the best policy in the world, part of this really comes down to what does Benjamin Netanyahu want to do?
Stay out of jail.
Yes, at least partially. So I don't know how much the U.S. can expect to be able to push the Israelis. The administration touts as accomplishments for U.S. policy that they got the Israelis to agree not to totally blockade humanitarian aid into Gaza. I mean, that's a pretty minor concession. So yeah, I do not envy the administration trying to figure out what to do. And then aside from the Netanyahu factor, then you've got Congress and
November, let's not forget about.
Yes, and November,
Would you
right?
do a lecture on Ukraine? I mean, we've got both those things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And again, Congress. I mean, it's embarrassing.
Yeah.
Well,
Sorry.
on that happy election
Yeah.
year conclusion, how about a big hand for Thank you everyone for being here. Next week, week 4 is Science and AI with Matthew Friedel from UW Milwaukee who will be here. And hope to see you next week as well. Don't forget to vote tomorrow. Thank you. Have a great night, everyone.
Oh, thanks.